Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming this afternoon to our latest installment of the conversation of the UC Davis Humanities Institute, or DHI, on the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, now roughly 1 year ago. My name is Jamie Fisher, and I'm a professor in the departments of German as well as Cinema and Digital Media, and the director of the DHI. Before we get started, we take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Putwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Putwin tribes: the Quechua-Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian community, the Quetzal-Dihi Wintun Nation, and the Yocha-Dihi Wintun Nation. The Putwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries, and it has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Also, before we commence, I would like to offer my heartfelt thanks to Gina Nunez and to Kathy Wallerstein for their help in making today's event possible, as well as Professor Sally McKee for helping organize today's event. The UC Davis Humanities Institute is a leading voice on our campus for the essential value of the arts and humanities. Part of our mission is to underscore how the humanities and arts can, and we think should, contribute to debates and controversies in our broader society. Today's topic on last year's January 6th attack on the Capitol certainly qualifies as a topic of both debate and controversies, especially in this an election year. As you all know, on January 6, 2021, an estimated 2,000 to 2,500 protesters illegally entered the US Capitol, forcing lawmakers and other staff there to flee and or hide. 5 people died during the attack and the resulting chaos. The origins and context of this attack and what it reflects about our country and what consequences it will have for our democracy are our topic today. And we've assembled a really fantastic panel of historians to weigh in on both the kind of context, origins, and the resonances and consequences of these attacks. Our format will be that we will hear short presentations by our 4 participants. I shall introduce each briefly. We shall hear each presentation, and then we will have, after all the presentations, an open discussion in the spirit of this conversation series of the DHI, which really emphasizes more casual engagement with some of the faculty around campus. You're all welcome to submit questions to the Q&A function. That's probably best for us, but we'll also be looking at the chat. And as I said, you can enter questions throughout the presentations as they occur to you, and the DHI staff and myself will kind of track the questions, and then I will pose those questions to the entire panel afterward. So we're going to go in the order that was announced on the poster, which actually is in alphabetical order. It works pretty well historically too, we think. So we're going to start with David Beal, go on to Greg Downs, and then Justin Leroy, and then Kathy Olmsted. So we're going to hear from David Beal first. So maybe the others turn their camera off. Thank you. And I'll introduce you, David, if you don't mind. Okay. So David Beal is the Emanuel Ringelblum Distinguished Professor in the History Department. He researches and teaches Jewish history, including courses on the Holocaust. And he's going to speak to us today on the topic, January 6th and the Fall of the Weimar Republic. Can historical analogies predict the future? Thank you for being with us, David.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and thank you to DHI for organizing this event. It's, I think, really important that we bring our knowledge, such as it is, to bear on issues of contemporary concern. Obviously, one of the key questions which historians struggle with is whether history or historical analogies actually have something to teach us about our present situation and the future. Some people believe the truism that history, if not studied, can repeat itself. I don't agree with that. I think history never repeats itself. The context of each event is different. The circumstances are different. Nevertheless, we can learn certain things about how events proceed in a different context and look at parallels in our own situation, if nothing else than to put us on guard when we see a development, as I think we have seen over the last 5 years with the Trump administration, and then especially since the election of November 2020, which cast serious doubt on whether the United States will continue to be a democracy. So what I'm doing today is talking about the fall of the Weimar Republic, and it's frequently the case, and when people think about the rise of authoritarian or dictatorial regimes, the first analogy they reach for is Weimar Germany. For obvious reasons, because the Nazi regime that emerged starting in January 30th of 1933 was indeed one of the worst regimes we've ever seen in modern times. I'm the only one on this panel who's actually not talking about American history. So in some ways, my colleagues probably can cast greater light on our present situation because the context in which they are working is shared really by our present circumstances. So I want to go through a number of aspects of starting out by talking about things that are actually different about Weimar Germany and its demise than what we're confronting in the United States. First of all, Weimar Germany was a very weak republic. It lasted only 15 years, actually a bit less. And Germany had a very weak democratic tradition. So in that sense, totally different from the United States, which of course has a very strong democratic tradition, albeit with a less than complete democracy. So Weimar Germany was much more vulnerable to the attacks on it than one might say the United States is. There's something actually quite interesting, though, in the way Hitler came to power. He came to power by totally democratic means, democratic in terms of the Constitution of Weimar Republic. He was appointed chancellor because the Nazi Party had become the largest party in Germany. The German political system was unable to really get past a kind of paralysis. There was rule by emergency decree since 1930. And a lot of politicians thought, well, the only way of solving the problem of paralysis of the various parties being unable to form a stable coalition was to bring Hitler into the government. And so he was appointed not by a coup, but by a perfectly legitimate procedure. But then, of course, he proceeded in short order to dismantle the Weimar Republic, its democratic institutions, and to substitute a dictatorship. What we're seeing in the United States actually is something rather different. That is the attempt to subvert the election process. In Germany, to the best of my knowledge, no one ever made massive claims of electoral fraud. There were a series of elections between 1930 and 1932, the period in which the Nazis become a major party. I don't believe that there have been allegations of major fraud. The Nazis themselves did not make such allegations, as far as I know. Here in this country, we are facing an attempt to discredit the electoral system by one party. So in that sense, it's kind of interesting because should American democracy fail, it will be because the democracy has been discredited by one party that claims that elections are fraudulent, or measures to suppress the vote, or measures to substitute state legislatures for the will of the people. None of that actually happened in Nazi Germany. A second way in which Germany was different is that starting in 1929, the worldwide depression hit Germany extremely hard, probably harder than any other country in the world. Massive unemployment, and it was really as a result of this that the Nazi Party, which had been negligible in the country, rose to a point of, at its peak, of 37% of the vote in July of 1932. They never achieved a majority. Even after Hitler became chancellor, they never got a majority in any kind of, in the only remaining election that took place after that. So the economic conditions really lent themselves towards the rise of a dictatorship. The country itself was unable to address this situation. It was politically paralyzed. And and furthermore polarized, and in that sense similar to the United States, very severely polarized. Although I would argue that the polarization in Germany was very different from what exists in the United States. In Germany, the extremes, the Nazis on the one hand and the communists on the other, eventually combined actually were commanded a majority of the seats in the German parliament. So we had these two extremes. We know that there were voters who changed from one side to the other in different elections. It's a different kind of polarization than we have in the United States, where obviously we're very polarized, but the kind of accusations that are made against the Democratic Party, that it is communist, it wants to institute a kind of socialist or communist revolution. In the case of Germany, that was really true of the communists. It's certainly not true here in the United States. If we want to look for a parallel, though, to the economic depression of the 1930s, we can really look to the COVID epidemic, I think, which in so many ways has unsettled, destabilized our political system, which appears to be really incapable of addressing this crisis. And in that sense, there is a certain similarity. What you had in Germany is something similar to what we have here now, and that in terms of the polarization, each side sees the other side as its mortal enemy, not just as an opponent, but as its mortal enemy, and that if the other side gains power, then it means essentially the end of the country as we know it. And that's a certain kind of symmetry, actually, that we have in our politics now in the United States, and that was certainly true in Germany as well. A couple of other factors, very briefly. First of all, the importance of conspiracy theories that my colleague, Professor Olmsted, is going to talk about in terms of the American context. In terms of Germany, the kind of granddaddy of all big lies or conspiracy theories was the claim that Germany had not, in fact, lost World War I, that the country had been stabbed in the back by various forces, notably the Jews. And this gave enormous energy to the anti-democratic forces that argued that the only way to right this wrong was really to overthrow the republic that came out of Germany's loss in World War I. So this conspiracy theory and other kinds of conspiracy theories, particularly about the role of the Jews in controlling the German economy and culture, played a very important role there. And we see the salience of conspiracy theories in our country. In addition, the Nazi Party was a white supremacist party. In that sense, not terribly different from white supremacists in this country. That kind of ideology actually argued that there is the true country, and then there are these people who don't really belong. And it's us versus them. And so the Nazis promised to the German people to overcome the polarization and fragmentation of the late Weimar period, and to institute a country of the folk, of the true German people. And I think that we hear similar echoes in the right-wing ideologies today in the United States. And finally, violence. Political violence had a very important role in Weimar Germany, starting with demobilized soldiers who formed militias, not too dissimilar from the militias that we see today. They assassinated the Jewish foreign minister of the Weimar Republic in June of 1922, Walter Rathenau. In the late 20s and early 30s, they engaged in street warfare against their enemies. There was political violence was rife in Germany, and perhaps the most important moment of such violence, because it also had a political purpose, was the famous Beer Hall Putsch in November of 1923, when Hitler led a group of Nazis to attempt to overthrow the Bavarian government and provoke a right-wing revolution in Germany. That was in many ways seen as a kind of buffoonish attempt. It was easily put down by the Bavarian police. People were killed. I think that that's very similar to what happened a year ago in Washington. That is an event that was really not terribly well organized, that probably could not have succeeded, and yet engaged in a kind of violence that made it clear that the forces on the right in both America and Germany were determined to use violence to overthrow the democratic order. And in terms of prediction, and of course predictions are cheap and are usually wrong, I would argue that if the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923 is in some ways the equivalent to what happened in Washington a year ago, that we can, I think, look forward to it not being the last such incident of its kind. Because if Germany is any kind of measure, then such an event is only the first act. It is not the last. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So as I mentioned, we're going to go in the order that was on the poster, which is the alphabetical order. And our next presenter is Gregory Downs. Greg Downs has written 3 books on slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, co-edits the Journal of Civil War Era History, and has helped lead public history efforts to commemorate Reconstruction. He's going to speak to us today on insurrections, rebellions, and coups in U.S. history. Thank you, Greg, for being here.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Many thanks to offer quickly. First to the staff at the DHI for doing such an excellent job of putting this together. I want to thank Jamie Fisher, Kathryn Wallerstein, Gina Nunez, and I want to thank the fellow panelists, but I also want to thank all of you all. I can totally understand the level of Zoom fatigue many people, I'll go ahead and say us have, and turnout, which is more than 200 right now, really demonstrates y'all's deep desire to learn and to know. In that context, I'm going to try and be relatively quick in order to make sure that we leave time for questions. And I'm excited to hear the kinds of questions people have and where your own ideas and thoughts are leading you, and what you think the relationship is between the histories of the United States and the events on January 6, 2021. I'll start with a really brief anecdote that actually is fitting for this, which is on January 6, 2021, I was teaching my Zoom classes as we were in winter quarter. And so was teaching into a very similar format to this, because large lectures, both on the history of the US up to the Civil War era, and a separate class on the Civil War era. And stepped out of those classes to see my children down from their rooms doing their Zoom classes in high school, saying, "Dad, you've got to come see this, you won't believe it," and then leading me in to watch the news, which is possibly the only time my teenage daughters have ever watched the actual news in order to watch what was unfolding. And that question that they raised of, "Can you believe it?" is one that I think people have wrestled with, both historians and many other people have wrestled with. Is it imaginable what happened? Many people at the time watching expressed that it was unimaginable. Certainly, it was a key part of the way that the news narrated it. And unprecedented. And many of the ways that responses even last week at the commemoration expressed it as something that was unimaginable and yet was true. There are certain narrow ways in which unprecedented, unimaginable, I'm going to come back to, but there are certain narrow ways in which unprecedented can narrowly be true, in the sense of there have been other attacks on the US Capitol. There have been, as well, I'll go through very quickly in a few minutes, other coups in US history. But the combination of an attack on the US Capitol during a presidential election with a resolution with a incumbent president seeming to egg on a mob to attack the Capitol, or at minimum to refuse to try and urge the mob to dismiss as they broke into the Capitol on a national scale, that is unprecedented. That you'll see some examples of things that may surprise you about some of the deeper roots of it. And so in one sense, that can make sense. But on another, the sort of expression of what's unimaginable or, in that sense, unprecedented, it rubbed me wrong a little bit as a historian, especially a historian who focuses on the era that I do, which is the Civil War era, but particularly the aftermath of the Civil War and the period we call Reconstruction, the effort to construct biracial governments that included freed people, more than 4 million people who had gained their freedom during the Civil War era, and for them to play a key role in shaping the governance and politics of the states they lived in, especially in the former Confederacy in the South. And I thought about a sort of odd and in many ways not very appealing character, but who in October of 1876 gave an unnervingly prescient speech. His name was Murat Halstead. Nobody really remembers him. He was one among many editors who gave lots of speeches and wrote lots of books. But in the midst of these battles over Reconstruction, knowing about serious efforts in the last few years before this, in the 1870s, to overthrow by force Southern state governments that had led to the US Army coming in and forcing people out of legislative chambers in Louisiana, among other places, in order to restore the civil government that had been elected. And also with the close attention to the flaws of the US Constitution, Halstead in October 1876 gave a speech about the dangers that the US would fall into another civil war. At the time, he framed it through these really interesting analogies to the civil wars going on in Mexico, which are sort of interesting in their own right. But what he pointed to as the mechanisms were the fact that the United States already included in 1876 an enormous, was home to an enormous range of violence against freed people and their allies in the South, formerly enslaved Black Southerners, claiming a place in government, who were being attacked not only individually, but at seats of power. And who believed that this would come home to roost, that it would rise up to a national level. And he also believed the US Constitution was notably failed to deal with the potential of a disputed presidential election. And for those reasons, he said that people underestimated the potential for another civil war. And he said what this added up to was something that amazed him. He had covered the US Civil War, which the Confederates had surrendered only 11 years before. But he said in that time that Americans had convinced themselves that the lesson of the Civil War is there could never be another one, which he thought was baffling and bizarre. And he said the lesson that Americans always had to keep relearning was, then his words, that the lesson that, quote, should never depart from us is that the American people have no exemption from the ordinary fate of humanity. In other words, Halstead didn't believe the US could have another civil war, though, which we'll talk about, or another episode of massive political violence because the US was because the US was special. He believed that it could happen here because the US was not, that this was built into the nature of politics and governance, at least in the mid-19th century. And he pointed to some of the examples that would show that. Some of these are ones that he knew about, and there were coups against governments, mostly in the United States South, mostly governments that included both Black Southerners and their white allies. Some of these have become relatively well known. The Colfax, Louisiana Massacre, probably, arguably, depending on definition, the single largest act of terrorism in US history until the attacks in Oklahoma City and those bombings, in which white supremacists surrounded the county courthouse or the parish courthouse, forced the biracial government to come out. When they came out with their hands up and surrendered, they were shot down. And all kinds of different estimates about how many people died and how many people fled, new government installed. Somewhat similar events in Eufaula, Alabama. On somewhat smaller, but not much smaller levels, individual officials forced out of office at gunpoint and new people installed. At the state level, Louisiana legislature attacked multiple times with people infiltrating the hallway and trying to drive others out. The US Army called into the Louisiana legislature to try to restore the biracial government. Attacks against governments in Arkansas and other places during this period. And the most famous coup in US history, the Wilmington Massacre, would happen 20 years later, in 1898, when a white supremacist mob marched through Black neighborhoods in Wilmington after an election, attacking indiscriminately Black people there, destroying the Black newspaper, and marching to the city hall, forcing the biracial government to flee and installing their own officials who hadn't won any election as the governance. That this sense that coups could happen and that they could be tied to this sense of who is legitimately the government of the United States, this white supremacist motivation for coups, and a claim that only, not just only white people, but only white people who are tied to a belief in white supremacy could be the legitimate government, was something that Olmstead was worried about. And he was also worried about a problem more of political science. The Constitution didn't really deal with the idea of organized efforts to resist the counting of the electoral votes. It turns out, as we'll come back to, that in some respects, Olmstead was right, and in some respects, he was wrong. There wasn't another civil war in 1876, but it was a closer call than most people thought. He was ridiculed for saying it and treated as a figure of fun. But over the course of the dispute, but there was a very disputed election. And over the course of that winter, militias in different states mustered up. New York appointed a anti-Republican militia leader, General McClellan, to arm them to prepare to march into Washington, D.C. The U.S. Army fortified the bridges connecting the D.C. to Maryland and Virginia to be ready to fight off an attack. And in this respect, the possibilities of organized violence and assault, he was right about, even if in fact it didn't quite happen. Why it didn't happen raises some interesting questions also that we can utilize to think with. One of those is one of the reasons it didn't happen is what is sometimes called the Compromise of 1877. There's complex and reasons why I don't like that particular phrase. But it did include but there was a mechanism to avoid overt political violence when the House and Senate reached different conclusions of who was the president. And that did diminish the possibility of an attack upon the Capitol. And 10 years later, though it's surprising that it took this long, there was a very partial effort to create a mechanism by law to govern the Electoral Count Act, which is in fact what did in some respects shape the choices that Vice President Pence and then Vice President Pence and others had on January 20 and between January 6th and January 20th of last year. But in other respects, the compromises and choices that were made also bear, grave warnings about the present. Because while it's sometimes overstated, as if in the so-called Compromise of 1877, Republicans agreed to withdraw troops from the South, which is not true. Troops did remain, and they did enforce at times federal laws through the 1880s. It was true that the bulwark of some of those embattled biracial state governments, Louisiana, where the Army had to drive out insurgents, that they withdrew from protecting the state legislative assemblies. And in the face of that, those governments collapsed. And that was a piece, not the only piece, but of the move toward the creation of white supremacist political systems in the South that for almost 3/4 of a century would run a system of disfranchise, excluding Black people from the vote, and of segregation in order to build a white supremacist order. So all of this, I think, can remind us, as Professor Beal said, of what we can and can't know as a historian. We can know things about the potential for violence within the US political system, the limits of the constitutional system for resolving disputed election, the relationship historically between racism and white supremacy and claims of government legitimacy, and the ways that people of color, especially Black people, can bear the cost of those outcomes. And yet we can also reckon with the ultimate lesson that Professor Beal also gestured to, that the future itself is unknowable, that as historians, we believe in contingency, that it's not predetermined. And we try to enter in to that future, not because we're certain of how it will turn out, but in fact, because we're uncertain. So I'll leave with two quotes. One, I do this in part because often I'm irritated by, figures, journalists who moved into history. But John Meacham, who has indeed said and written things that I thought were very hard to defend historically, at the commemoration actually said something that I think is wise, and I'll try and connect it. He said, there was never a once upon a time in American history. That I think is absolutely right. To the degree unimaginable meant people told themselves a fairy tale about the past, that's important to defeat. There was never a once upon a time, and there's not going to be a happily ever after. It's an unfolding job. I think that's right. And I want to connect it to end with a different figure from the 19th century, much better known, which is Frederick Douglass. One of the most famous quotes in US history, and hopefully one you already know, which is Douglass in a celebration of West Indian days, the West Indian Day Emancipation, said the whole history of human progress, of human liberty, shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all-absorbing, and for the time being, putting all other tumults to silence. It must do this or it does nothing. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are those who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waves, of its many waters. With that mix of pessimism of what's possible in the US, and also I hope grounds for realistic optimism that the future is not written if we can fight for it, I'll turn over to my distinguished colleague.
Thank you very much, Greg. Our next presenter, again going alphabetically, is Justin Leroy. Justin Leroy teaches courses on slavery, African-American history, and the history of race. He is finishing a book on the relationship between emancipation and the rise of capitalism in the 19th century United States. His scholarly expertise in the abolition of slavery led to an interest in movements working for modern-day prison and police abolition, and he is part of a UC faculty organization working to get police officers off of our university campuses. He's going to speak to us today about race, white supremacy, and the insurrection. Thank you for being here, Justin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on this panel. So today I'm just going to offer a few thoughts on how the Capitol insurrection relates to race and white supremacy. And instead of saying too much about historical parallels or precedents, I'll give a perspective on our present situation that's informed by my point of view as a historian. So the day of or the day after the insurrection, Biden said that had this group of people been Black Lives Matter protesters, they would have been treated very different. This is a quotation. They would have been treated very differently than the mob of thugs that stormed the Capitol. We all know that is true, and that is totally unacceptable. And a few months ago, last October, Biden sort of reiterated this point, and he said that he thought the actions of the insurrectionists were motivated by white supremacy. And I think we don't have to look very hard to see that Biden was more or less right on both the question of differential treatment and the question of motivation. Right. I said I wasn't going to kind of do too much history, and I won't, but I will say that there is a long history of white supremacists reacting against federal or state policies if they perceive those policies to infringe upon states' rights or individual liberties. And these liberties can be tied to white supremacy in very overt ways, but also in more subtle or complex ways. And the reaction too can range from ignoring or nullifying said policies or undermining them through violence. And these dynamics were central components of secession and Reconstruction in the 19th century, as Professor Downs showed us. But this issue also persisted into the 20th century. A big example would be that after the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 that desegregated schools in the South, many Southern senators declared that they would refuse to acknowledge or accept the ruling and described it as an affront to the autonomy of state governments. And so this Southern coordination to nullify the Brown decision is known as massive resistance. And just actually last month, a small California town did something sort of similar that was drawing on this legacy, Oroville, California, sort of saying that it was going to be a constitutional republic, formed in defiance of California laws and policies around COVID, right? And so even though that particular form of kind of nullification or reacting against state laws didn't directly invoke white supremacy, it kind of is tied to this political strategy that is always sort of referencing the way that it's entrenched in a history of white supremacy. And so this history has really set up the expectation that in the US, white supremacy doesn't have a whole lot of consequences, right? Another kind of California example is the Black Panthers, entering the state capitol in Sacramento in 1967. It led to the it helped pass the Mumford Act, which prohibits carrying loaded firearms in public in California. And it was part of a wave of gun control legislation in the late 1960s that was kind of implicitly aimed at Black people. And so we can see the level of action that was spurred partially in response to fear of armed Black people in sort of contradistinction to more recent armed white supremacists entering various Capitol buildings in the past 2 years, including Oregon in December of 2020 and Michigan in April 2021 with few, in some cases, no repercussions. And that very recent history, as well as a longer history, should maybe make us rethink the sense of shock that we had watching things unfold on January 6th. I think Biden was also right on that question of differential treatment. Last year, it was largely a hypothetical. Now, a year later, we have some data to back up the gut reaction that we may have had in agreement. There was a lot of comparison between the summer 2020 Black Lives Matter protests and the insurrection. All said and done, there have been a little over 700 arrests for January 6th, but on the day of, there were only 61 as compared to a June 1st protest in DC in support of Black Lives Matter, where there were more than 300 arrests. Only a small fraction of the insurrectionists have been tried and sentenced so far, but from the kind of preliminary results, about equal proportions got jail or prison time versus house arrest or probation. So with a few high-profile exceptions that have received sentences, between 4 and 5 years, the results have been fairly lenient, especially compared to the average sentence of a Black Lives Matter protester from the summer of 2020, which has been about 2 years in prison. Many of them have been ordered to pay massive fines, have been denied bail. Some protesters who attacked empty police cars have been either sentenced or recommended to be sentenced to up to 10 years in prison, which is a pretty hefty sentence for what amounts ultimately to property damage. And I think in a lot of ways, it's really hard not to get really mad about that difference, right? It's hard not to feel satisfaction when we see these January 6th defendants start crying and begging in court. It's hard not to want them to go to jail for a much longer period of time than 18 months or something like that. But I think ultimately the idea that accountability for the insurrectionists would take the form of harsher sentences is kind of wrong-headed, right? I don't think it would send a deterring message to white supremacists. I don't know if it would make our elections safer. And I think it sort of overlooks how investing in strengthening the criminal punishment system and the system of policing that undergirds it is antithetical to struggles for racial justice, even in moments like this where there's a feeling that it really is the right solution and we kind of crave that punishment, right? So in other words, I don't see these I don't highlight these sentencing discrepancies between Capitol insurrectionists and Black Lives Matter protesters to imply that the solution is harsher sentences for the insurrectionists. I highlight the discrepancies to say that the criminal justice system can entrench unequal outcomes, even or maybe especially in situations when we feel like it is operating in a just or appropriate way, as when these January 6th people are tried and convicted, right? I think Biden has, in the wake of January 6th, he kind of reiterated his support for increased domestic terrorism legislation, and that kind of opens us to this question. When we think about the fact that Black Lives Matter protesters were treated differently than white supremacists, what's the desired outcome in this situation, right? Do we want highly militarized police forces confronting all protesters? Would Black Lives Matter protesters who break the windows of storefronts or tip over police cars be categorized in the same way as white supremacists who storm Capitol buildings with guns? The potential conflation of these many different types of people into the legal category of something like terrorists sort of suggests to me that we can't kind of punish or police our way out of these political crises produced by a long history of white supremacy, right? The last point I'll make is that you may remember that in response to the summer 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, there was a wave of Republican-sponsored legislation that proposed criminalizing various forms of protest, things like damaging monuments or obstructing roads. And that sort of shows us how this call to increased punishment for protesters who we think are not in fact protesters, but terrorists or insurrectionists is a really slippery slope, and that kind of penal power can very easily and very quickly be turned from the people you think of as Professor Beal said, your political mortal enemy, to the people that you kind of identify with politically. And of course, when we kind of think of, policing and carceral punishment as the solution to white supremacist assaults on democracy, then one of the main calls of racial justice organizing in the past couple of years to defund or abolish the police starts to seem totally unimaginable, right? It's not just the right that tells us those things are impossible. Our own kind of horizon of political imagination starts to make them impossible in turn. So I think I'll end there, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Justin. Before we get to our last presenter, I just want to remind people, our attendees, that we welcome all questions. We should have plenty of time for questions to the panel. You can specify a question for a specific panelist, or you can pose your question to all the panelists. Probably easiest for us is if you put it in the Q&A function of Zoom webinar, but also feel free to put it in the chat window. So our last presenter is Kathryn Olmstead. Kathryn Olmstead is a professor of history. She specializes in the political and cultural history of the United States in the 20th and 21st centuries. She's the author of 5 books, including Real Enemies, Conspiracy Theories in American Democracy, World War I to 9/11. And she'll be speaking to us today about conspiracy theories and the insurrection. Thank you, Professor Olmstead, for being here today.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jamie. And thank you to the Davis Humanities Institute and to Gina and Kathy for arranging everything. And thanks to my co-participants. I'm very excited to be part of this discussion. I actually have some slides that I will share here. Give me a second. All right. So I'm going to talk about conspiracy theories in the insurrection because I am a historian of conspiracy theories in US history. And I'm sure that you're all aware that conspiracy theories go way back in US history. In fact, before the creation of the United States, even before the first English colonists set foot on American shores, there were conspiracy theories in America. And there were conspiracy theories over the years about Catholics, about Jews, about Mormons, about bankers, about railroads, about alleged false flag attacks by the government. In recent years, there have been conspiracy theories about who killed JFK, about 9/11, about Sandy Hook. The list goes on and on. So American conspiracy theories are as American as apple pie. So the question would be, what's different about the insurrection? Are conspiracy theories today different from these conspiracy theories that have marked American history? Is there something unprecedented about them, or is it just another upsurge as we have seen throughout American history? And I'm going to argue that the difference here, the thing that really distinguishes our current era of conspiracy from previous eras of conspiracy theorizing in American history, is that at the insurrection last year, you had a president of the United States and now an ex-president who is inspiring these conspiracy theories, spreading them, endorsing them. And not just the president, but many political leaders are spreading and endorsing these conspiracy theories. And that really is unusual in US history. So let me talk briefly about the conspiracy theories surrounding the insurrection that inspired the insurrection. And then I want to talk about Donald Trump's history with conspiracy theories. So as you know from looking at the pictures of the insurrection, there were many people there who were adherents of the QAnon conspiracy theory. And we can see this in the clothing that they were wearing, like this man, so that they believed in this QAnon conspiracy theory that the leaders of the Democratic Party are a group of Satan-worshiping pedophiles who are kidnapping children and killing them and drinking their blood. So there were many QAnon adherents at the insurrection. There were a lot of people who believed that COVID-19 is a hoax. That was another popular conspiracy theory. But the theory that really held them all together was the big lie, the conspiracy theory that the election had been stolen by Joe Biden, and in fact, Trump was the real winner. This is despite the fact that Biden had a margin of 7 million votes, a decisive margin in the Electoral College, and that every judge, Republican and Democratic, who has heard lawsuits alleging fraud in the 2020 election has said that there is no evidence of any kind of fraud that would have changed the outcome. So despite all of that, the invaders of the Capitol all believed in this conspiracy theory. And what we are understanding now, and I think we will understand even more in the next few months as the January 6th committee reports, is the degree to which the president himself was leading this charge, was spreading these theories, and the degree to which this insurrection was part of a long-term plan to overturn the results of the 2020 election. And we did know at the time that the president spoke at the White House at a rally that inspired the mob to go to the Capitol, and that he said to the group that there's somebody in there who should not be in there. Biden and our country will be destroyed if they didn't do something about it. We're not going to stand for that. He told them to go to the Capitol and fight like hell. If you don't fight like hell, you won't have a country anymore. So even at the time we understood the degree to which he was unleashing the mob on the Capitol, I don't think we understood the degree to which there were many people in government, like the director of the CIA, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who were seriously worried that there was going to be some sort of coup. And as we learn more about Trump's role in inspiring the insurrection and unleashing the mob, I think it's useful to put this in the context of the way that Trump, throughout his political career, used conspiracy theories very strategically and got into national politics by using conspiracy theories, by weaponizing them. And that is what makes him unusual, not that there are conspiracy theories, that's not unique to our age, but the fact that we had a president who was spreading these theories. So if we go back to the beginning of Trump's entry into national politics in 2011, he first attracted attention when he was considering running against Barack Obama in 2012, when Obama was up for re-election. And Trump started getting a lot of attention by giving interviews where he suggested that there might be some truth to the birther conspiracy theory, that Obama had actually been born in Africa and therefore was not eligible to be president. So here are some quotes from interviews that he gave in 2011. Growing up, nobody knew him. The whole thing is very strange. There's something on that birth certificate he doesn't like. When I started talking about it, I thought he was born in this country. Now I have some real doubts. This is a common technique of conspiracy theorists, as they say. They don't just directly assert the conspiracy theory. They say, I'm just raising questions here. Then after Trump decided not to run in 2012 and Obama did win re-election, he continued to spread the birther conspiracy theory through Twitter, among other things, encouraging hackers to break into Obama's college records to see if he might have confessed on those records that he was born in Africa. Trump also in interviews suggested again and again that perhaps one might understand Obama's alleged failure to win the war on terror to his direct alleged sabotage of the war on terror because of, again, his alleged birth in Africa and his non-existent Muslim ties. So that Trump often said things like this. Here's a quote from one of his interviews. Why doesn't he solve the problem, terrorist attacks? There's something we don't know about. There's something we don't know about. In other words, just raising questions about why he might have other loyalties. He also spread the false theory that Obama wore a ring that had an Arabic inscription. This was not true. Obama did not wear a ring that had an Arabic inscription, but this was widely believed to be a sign that Obama had allegiance to foreign nations and allegedly this so-called foreign religion. Trump also espoused a lot of other conspiracy theories in 2014, 2015, as he was gearing up running for president, not just confined to the birther conspiracy theory. He talked a lot about He was very eclectic in his embrace of various conspiracy theories. He suggested that he might believe that the MMR vaccine caused autism in toddlers. He suggested in one tweet that the concept of global warming, of climate change, had been invented by the Chinese to hurt American industry. And then there was a theme of him suggesting over and over again in interviews and on Twitter that Obama's administration was just making up facts, the numbers that it gave the public on just about everything, that in fact the unemployment rate might be 42%, that deportations were not at a record low, as Obama said, we're not at a record high, but in fact at a record low. He said that the Obama administration was lying about Obamacare enrollments, that in other words, you could not trust anything that the Obama administration said. And then he suggested over and over again that the 2012 election had been stolen and that there had been widespread fraud that had led to Obama's reelection. So in other words, that Americans could not trust their elections as early as 2012. So with his embrace of conspiracy theories, his decision to put conspiracy theory at the center of his worldview as part of his appeal to American voters, it was no surprise that he began claiming that he had actually won the 2020 election and that he had primed his supporters to believe this, to believe that they could not trust the government to give them the truth about the vote totals. And in fact, the Democrats were inclined to lie and to cheat and to steal and to rig these elections. I want to close by looking at a couple of numbers that I have found deeply disturbing from some recent polls. There are some polls in the fall of 2021 related to the January 6th insurrection, asking people what they thought about the insurrection, what they thought about Trump's role, and indeed, if they believed the big lie, if the election had been stolen. About 34% of Americans said that they agreed that the 2020 election had been rigged, had been stolen. This is sort of comparable to 9/11 conspiracy theories. So 34% is not out of whack when you're looking at the long history of American conspiracy theories. But it is very polarized, with 68% of Republicans, so 2 out of 3 Republicans, believing that Donald Trump actually is the real president of the United States right now, and 82% of Fox News viewers believing that the election had been stolen. And the last thing I want to show you is this graphic that I grabbed off a website that had a story about the NPR PBS Marist poll from October of 2021 that asked this question: if your candidate for president does not win in 2024, do you trust that the results are accurate or not? So in other words, they're asking people 3 years before the election, if your candidate loses in 3 years, do you think the election is fair? And 82% of Democrats said, yeah, I guess so, and 68% of independents, but only 33% of Republicans said in 2021, 3 years before the election, before the votes are counted, even before the campaigns, that if a Democrat wins, that they can trust that that was the actual result. In other words, 2/3 of Republicans are primed to believe that no matter what happens in the course of the election, what the polls say, that if a Democrat wins, that Democrat will be illegitimate. And that I find deeply concerning. And I'm afraid that this is a recipe for great political instability in this country and potentially political violence. All right, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Professor Olmstead, for those sobering numbers and presentation overall. Excellent presentation. Yeah, invite everybody to come back on camera, and I think everyone is there. And we have a whole bunch of good questions in the Q&A, and I think, so I'll pose the questions and then we'll go through them. We try to put them in some kind of order. Sometimes if we have a whole bunch of questions. We kind of batch them together and have them answered together. And then I think we have about 20 minutes. So again, if you're in the audience, first of all, thank you for coming today. And we welcome all questions in the Q&A function, I think most easily for us, or via chat. So, okay, so the first question we had was from Adavu, and the question is, I like what Professor Leroy said about how punishments and criminalizing white supremacy is a sort of gray area when it comes to solutions. I was wondering what solutions the panelists think would be better to combat white supremacy. So I guess maybe Professor Leroy could start, but we welcome any perspectives from the other panelists as well.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think my answer sort of touches on some of the other questions posed as well. But I think it's important to remember that the the kind of political status quo that we are living through now didn't come out of nowhere, and it goes back further even than some of the obvious precedents. And one of the ways that Republicans have built power over the past 4 decades really is to recognize that you can't transform politics on a national level immediately, and you kind of build political power by starting locally. And I think that's sort of an important way for all of us to maintain perspective, right? It can be very overwhelming and just depressing to think about, some of these numbers, the kind of way that voting rights are being restricted and districts are being redrawn, but we all kind of live someplace. And so we can kind of learn how decisions are made where we live, kind of look at who is in office and what they do, and kind of how you can kind of become involved in changing things where you are, even as none of us kind of can as individuals change things at the kind of biggest level. We actually have a lot of venues for doing things on a smaller level, and that's how you kind of grow political power over time, right? The kind of people who comprise these school boards that are kind of teaching about certain topics illegal, are there for a reason. And that's because they kind of chose to run for these positions because they understood the political power it could hold. And so that can work in reverse as well, I think.
Thank you. Any other thoughts about how we can combat white supremacy? Because I think as a number of our panelists made clear, that's really a crucial variable in what happened in these events. And I don't know if anyone saw this article in The Atlantic. I forget what I think I have the title here. Let's see. Trump's coup has already begun. It was a much discussed article by Barton Gellman. And I think one of the main facts he mentioned was that the demographic of the people who turned the kind of protest violent and into a riot and insurrection was actually that many of them lived in communities where the kind of racial makeup of the community was changing rapidly, just to underscore the relevance of white supremacy in the riot and insurrection. So,
yeah, that's a very powerful piece. For the people in the audience, second that recommendation. I also want to second Professor Leroy's recommendation. I think it's easier to, for the importance of local action organizing. I think it's easier to think of things that are necessary to fight it but harder to say exactly what's going to be sufficient, partly just because of humility about predicting the present, also because of an awareness of the sort of scale of the challenge. But some of the things, so I can't promise, I'm not saying I'm certain all of these will work, but I think they are pieces of the puzzle. In that sense of protecting local power, building local power arrangements, and building movements that really reach out to people. I think that, one of the important things is going to be both building movements that can, sustain a powerful core and yet also keep broadening. And this was a sort of constant strain within the 19th century of how to do this. And it's a constant strain in the 20th century, and it's a constant strain now. But I do believe, that there were, that is ultimately, the most optimistic path out of it. Though it's not easy to do, and it's not easy to keep meeting people where they are and trying to convince not the people Professor Olmsted was talking about, but the sort of people out there who can be persuaded to involve themselves in a broad movement. William Barber's moral majority and its idea of a third Reconstruction is one effort to really build on the ground, often though not only locally focused in North Carolina, a movement that does really aim to cross, divides of race and class and other divides to articulate the common goals that the movement sees in a third Reconstruction.
Okay, maybe we'll move on. We have a question from Mario Gonzalez. I think I'll save the second question till toward the end of the panel because I think it poses a really overarching, important question that all panelists can address. Mario Gonzalez asks, do the panelists feel capital punishment would be the right punishment for the ex-president and his enablers if they were put on trial and found guilty? And I guess this raises, whatever the perspective on capital punishment, the question in general of what would be effective punishment or maybe productive punishment of the riot and insurrection. Tough question.
I think this, beyond, personal kind of moral objections to capital punishment, I think this falls into the category of if you normalize something kind of horrific as appropriate for your political opponents or enemies, it is almost inevitable that that will be used in ways that you don't anticipate and would not approve of. So, for those reasons as well, I would say that would be a very kind of dangerous route to go.
Well, I mean, to give some perspective from the German side, Hitler was, after the Munich beer hall putsch, he was imprisoned for a very short time. It was when he wrote Mein Kampf. It was very, cushy. People said at the time, the police are blind in the right eye. Okay, so in other words, it sort of reinforces Professor Leroy's argument about the differential in the way the police react to, different types of demonstrators. But I think that, look, I would be completely opposed to capital punishment. But I do think that some kind of serious accountability is necessary. If Trump and his henchmen could get away with nearly overthrowing the democratic order without any kind of accountability, then it's very hard to imagine the next round. I mean, the real question I think now is, can the Republic defend itself? And I think the jury is out on that. I'm not sure we can. I'm not sure, I would like to see a much more aggressive action by the Department of Justice with respect to not the low-level guys, the people who went in there, and but with respect to the people who organized it. And I think that that's absolutely essential. Otherwise, if the democracy cannot defend itself, then unfortunately it deserves to die.
Okay, well, I'll move on. Sorry, we have quite a few questions, so we're trying to figure out in kind of what order to go, balancing the time with which people submitted them versus their topical relevance. I'll ask this one about kind of political information from Nicole Richardson. For all the panelists, do you think that if news and politics were presented as pure fact and with more primary sources as opposed to being presented by networks aligning with certain parties, would the US be less polarized? And I think this, you could take this also sort of generally about the kind of ecosystem of political news and information out there. So certainly resonates with the conspiracy theory concern, and then raises this issue of, is there kind of objective political news? How can we get to a kind of more commonly accepted political news, because obviously a decent percentage of the country, as Professor Olmsted showed, believe that the election was stolen.
You want to start, Kathy, if because
Sure. I mean, I would say that I wouldn't agree that that there's much powerful media that is aligned with the Democrats, that takes Democratic talking points uncritically. But there is the rise of Fox News since the mid 90s is very important for understanding today's environment, because before then, the TV networks really did try to have some sort of, ideal of objectivity, even if they fell short of it. Whereas Fox News is clearly, oftentimes, especially with the commentators, just right-wing propaganda. And in Fox News is not even the most radical these days. Is that I didn't put on the slide there because it seems sort of obvious, but 97% of people who watch One American Network believe that the election was stolen. So Fox is itself becoming radicalized because there are more radical alternatives on the right for viewers. So I think that the rise of right-wing media and right-wing media's the tendency of right-wing media to propagate these lies, to the extent that many conservative commentators have been quitting Fox News because they have decided it has gone too far onto the dark side, is a real problem for democracy. I'm not exactly sure how to combat it, except that, perhaps the Democrats could put their money behind some sort of liberal media alternative, some rival to Fox on the left, but that does take tremendously deep pockets.
Good. Anybody else? I mean, I think the silence is telling. It's a very difficult issue. I think, obviously the environment ecosystem for political news now is highly partisan, and it's not clear, I think, as Professor Olmsted indicated, what the solution could be. We have a couple questions about conspiracy theories. One from William Sheed. How does one adopt the mindset to accept conspiracy theories? Are there people who truly believe in these conspiracy theories and others who only just use these conspiracy theories for their own political means? And added, how many of the 2/3 of Republicans who claim this is a stolen election fall into the latter camp? And how many do we think actually believe this? And then Daniel Schmidt asks a related question. What's the difference between the conspiracy theories that Trump has supported and his hundreds of outright lies on just about everything he talks about?
Right, well, I'll take that. Those are both very good questions. I would say that as far as do people really believe these conspiracy theories? Boy, that is so hard to know. I mean, how do you test that? Do you ask the people you're polling over and over again, is this really what you believe, or is it just instrumental? I think for a lot of political leaders, political conspiracy theories are instrumental. They can use them, they can weaponize them to win. I don't know if that's the case for Trump. He might actually believe that he won the election because he has to believe that he won the election. But I think that there are many other people who are spouting this lie, who know it's a lie, but it's useful to them. As far as grassroots, it's really hard to say. One of the pictures I showed people saying Trump won the legal vote. And I think that part of the way that people who say they believe this lie convince themselves of it is they say, well, even if the voting machines weren't rigged or whatever crazy conspiracy theories are out there, there are certain people who are real Americans and who legally vote. And then there are people who aren't real Americans and they're voting for the Democrats, and therefore the right people voted for Trump. And so Trump should be president. Like, it's this long, complex process in their brain that gets them to saying the election was stolen, even if they don't believe the most extreme theories about, China and lasers and some guy in Italy changing the results. As far as the other one, what's the difference between conspiracy theories and lies? I mean, you could say that a debunked conspiracy theory is sort of a very complex lie. You know, black is white is a lie. I think that Obama's birth certificates and the newspaper announcements of his birth and all of the eyewitness accounts of his birth in Hawaii in 1961 are fake, because I believe he was really born in Africa. Is that a lie or is that a conspiracy theory?
That's a really wise answer. The only piece I would, just say in elaboration would be, whether it's good or bad news, as Professor Olmstead knows better than I do, conspiracy theories in US politics, as she said at the start, go way back. And there are some examples. I don't know that they tell us what's the solution, but there are some examples of some seeming to fade. There was a political party organized around belief that the Masons were, dominating juries, and it had very intricate, readings of jury verdicts in, small counties in Western New York, and it became huge. And then the political winds shifted, and while, sort of odd ideas about the Masons continued to circulate, it lost its political valence. So I don't know that it teaches us how to get out of them as much as to give us some belief that it's possible at times for a society to escape from them.
Okay, and we're just about at time. I think I'll wrap up with two questions that invite kind of an overall take from all of you. From William Sheed, we get the question, what can we do from here on? Should we educate our fellow citizens who believe in different truths? How do we overcome the entrenchment of white supremacy and misinformation in society? And an anonymous attendee asks, if you were the president right now, what actions would you take, if any, in response to the January 6th events? So a kind of, overarching response that you think would be productive, and maybe that could be wrapped into a concluding statement from each of you, if that's okay. Maybe start with David Beal, sorry. Going alphabetically again. Sorry, David, you're muted, I think.
Yeah, sorry. Unfortunately, I hate to level a critique at this event. We are to some degree talking in a bubble here. That is, the people that we would like to try to convince are probably not here in our audience. The University of California at Davis is a relatively liberal progressive bubble. I mean, there's a range of opinion, obviously. But the kind of people who believe in these conspiracy theories are generally not to be found among our students or faculty. And so therefore, even though I obviously believe in education, that's what I do, I'm not really all that optimistic that what we're doing within the classroom or within an event like this is actually going to move the needle at all. The truth is I'm very pessimistic. I think that there could be an upswell of revulsion against these conspiracy theories, against the white supremacy, and that we might get some sanity again. But there are all these forces we've been talking about, like the fragmentation in the media, which make it much more difficult to see such a backlash emerging. But one can only hope for that.
I think that's really true and very good points. The good news is this recording will go on YouTube, which is not a liberal bubble. So let's see, Greg Downs.
Yeah, they're good questions, and I don't want to end up repeating my distinguished colleagues. So I think the piece that I would emphasize actually does draw from, I'm going to cheat a little bit, Jamie, and draw from a Q&A that I also saw in there about the sense of optimism, and I do believe, that hope is a muscle, and and the idea of a pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will or the spirit. That optimism is something you cultivate and an awareness of the limits. But a questioner asked if I believed my students were optimistic or pessimistic. This I actually, thanks to help from Professor Beal at a different point on a teaching tool, have specific information on, because I survey my students and then show them the results. And I was really interested that, that this year, and like last year, in the midst of this, the vast majority of the students, something close to 70% each year, kind of sat in the sort of split almost evenly between mildly optimistic and mildly pessimistic. And that both the sort of, fiercely pessimistic and fiercely optimistic were smaller groups. And I do take, it's possible to be cynical about that, but I do take some hope from the sense that even, people by and large at this relatively early stage of life, certainly compared to my august age, confronting such dramatic crises that have shaped their adolescence, still find reason for measured, not hopeless, not fruitless optimism, but for measured optimism, or even for a leavened pessimism, a worry, but that's not a moving towards cynicism. Something I take hope in and try and cultivate in myself, not to let worry or pessimism turn into cynicism. So.
Thank you, Greg. Justin?
Yeah, I agree that these are great questions. I guess I agree that we sometimes sort of operate in a bubble in a university, but I also don't know if that's a bad thing. I mean, this is sort of at the edges of my knowledge, but I believe that, when people kind of come back from, participation in white supremacist movements or kind of beliefs in conspiracy theories, it's people from their own community who help them do that. It's not, some random college professor who can kind of make those tremendous transformations. I mean, maybe sometimes, but again, I guess that's maybe just to emphasize the role of affecting those who are closest to us, right? If your family or parents, subscribe to some of these beliefs, or uncles or whatever, maybe you start with them. I, like anyone, have gotten into shouting matches with members of my family over political things, but have had a good amount of success, doing, shifting views among people kind of close to me. And I think that's sort of where to start.
Great, thank you, Justin. Kathy, maybe last word.
I take tremendous hope from my students. I teach a class on conspiracy theories just about every year. And each time I teach it, I think, oh, this is the time it's not going to work. It's going to blow up. There's going to be shouting matches and judgment and people with closed minds. And it's just going to be a disaster. And, fingers crossed it hasn't happened yet. The students here are extremely open-minded and interested in learning from each other. And so every time I'm in the classroom, especially, but even virtually, I have more faith in the future, hope for the future whenever I interact with students.
Great, well, thank you all for participating. That was fantastic. So thanks to our participants, our presenters, and to the attendees, and to all those posing those great questions. Keep an eye open for the next DHI event. We'll have another conversation event, I think in March is our next one. So thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate it. And take care, stay safe, stay healthy, and hopefully we'll see each other in person soon.